On a stormy night in Asheville, young Sophie heard a strange noise in the garage. From that moment on, a mischievous little raccoon entered their lives, turning a quiet home, and even the whole neighborhood, into a stage for comedy and chaos. Yet behind the laughter lies a heartwarming story about connection, love, and what it truly means to be family. The rain in Asheville didn't fall so much as it settled, a steady gray curtain that softened the edges of the Blue Ridge and turned every driveway into a shallow creek. Emily Carter stood in her small kitchen, still in scrubs, fishing a tea bag out of a chipped mug. It had been one of those shifts, endless blood pressures, a stubborn IV, and a patient who only relaxed when Emily hummed an old hymn under her breath. She was halfway through her first sip when her phone buzzed on the counter. "Mom, there's something in the garage." She frowned, set the mug down. Sophie never texted from the house. She was only 11, the type to appear in a doorway like a wisp of smoke and speak in a whisper. Another buzz. "I think it's a raccoon, and it's hurt." Emily's stomach tightened. The wind pushed a wet hand against the window. "Stay where you are," she called, already moving. "Don't open the door." Sophie was waiting in the hallway, wrapped in an oversized hoodie, eyes bright with nerves and something like wonder. The garage door rattled in its frame as the rain picked up. Emily grabbed a flashlight and a roll of gauze from the hall closet, a reflex she didn't pause to question, and nodded toward the back door. The garage smelled like wet cardboard and old oil, the scent of a life patched together with second-hand shelves and yard sale tools. Emily thumbed the flashlight on. The thin beam skated over a stack of Christmas bins, a rust-specked bicycle, the storage trunk that never latched right, and landed on a dark lump tucked behind a box fan near the wall. It moved. Sophie squeezed Emily's sleeve. "Do you see her?" "Hold on." Emily crouched, knees creaking. The beam settled on a small, soaked creature with silvered fur and a bandit's mask. One front paw was swollen like a knot of unripe fruit. The eyes, black glass marbles in the light, blinked, not mean, not tame, simply awake. The little body quivered, but didn't bolt. "Hi there," Emily said, her voice going to that nurse-soft place reserved for skittish patients and second chances. "You're a long way from wherever you were headed." Sophie let go of her sleeve and whispered, "She came to us." "Sophie," Emily murmured, not unkindly. "Step back a little." She slid the flashlight onto a shelf so its beam washed the corner without blinding the animal. With the other hand, she tore a square of the gauze free and folded it into a pad. Old muscle memory did the rest. Keep the movement slow. Keep the voice low. Narrate what you're doing, so your own heartbeat doesn't spook you. "I'm going to take a look. If she tries to run, we let her." She eased forward. The raccoon's ears flicked. Her nose twitched. For a moment, nothing else in the world moved. The rain quieted. The garage door stilled. Even Sophie's breath felt suspended, like the air before a song begins. Emily stretched the gauze toward the swollen paw. The raccoon exploded, not with teeth, not with claws, but with theater. She jerked backward, swiped once at empty air, and knocked a metal toolbox off the shelf with the precision of a stage cue. The lid sprang open, sockets and wrenches clattering like cymbals across the concrete. Sophie squeaked, then clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes shining despite the fright. A roll of tape spun in a perfect slow circle and bumped Emily's shoe. "Okay," Emily said softly, blinking the surprise away. "We have a comedian." "Mom," Sophie whispered, and Emily heard the fragile light in her daughter's voice. a sound she hadn't heard much since the move, since the lawyers, since the nights when the house felt too wide. "She's funny." The raccoon froze, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the light. No hissing, no show of teeth, just that narrow, alert face, waiting. Emily could see the paw more clearly now. The ankle was swollen, not broken, if luck held. The fur was soaked to the skin, clumped into dark stripes. The little creature was all bones and nerve. "We can't keep a raccoon," Emily said quietly. She said it for Sophie, and for herself, and for the closed-in world of rules that had kept her steady when the floor dropped out. She said it while she shrugged off her rain jacket and spread it on the floor in front of the animal like a peace offering. "But we can get her warm and dry and fed, and then we call the right people." Sophie nodded, swallowing, as if swallowing meant agreement could settle and not float away. "Just for tonight?" "Just for tonight." The raccoon watched as Emily slid the jacket closer, inch by inch, until the hood brushed the creature's good paw. Emily held her breath. The raccoon lowered her chin, sniffed the fabric, and, in a move so delicate it surprised a laugh out of Emily's tired chest, tucked her nose into the far corner of the hood, like a child stashing a secret. Emily gathered the jacket around her, lifted with both hands. The weight was hardly anything. Back in the kitchen, the creature became a small mountain inside a laundry basket lined with towels. The storm's grey light pooled on the linoleum. Emily found the old space heater in the pantry, set it a few feet away, and watched the raccoons shivering slow. Sophie hovered with a bowl of water and a saucer, where Emily had cut up a piece of rotisserie chicken into slivers. The raccoon sniffed, dismissed, then nosed the saucer again as if reconsidering a joke, and finally took one precise bite. "She's starving," Sophie said, reverent. "She's deciding," Emily answered. "There's a difference." They tried the wildlife numbers Emily found online. The first line went to a recorded message. The second routed them to a center that didn't take raccoons. The third suggested leaving the animal where it was found and letting nature do what nature does. Emily listened to the options, to the strange confidence of a recorded voice telling her to do the thing her hands refused to do. She hung up. "How bad is her paw?" Sophie asked, crouched on the far side of the basket. "Sprained, maybe," Emily said. "If I were guessing." "You're a nurse," Sophie said, as if that title could lift a city bus or part a river. "You're good at broken things." Emily's laugh came out thin. She reached for the gauze again, cut a narrower strip. "We'll wrap it lightly, enough support to rest it. No heroics." When she slipped the strip around the tiny ankle, the raccoon tolerated the touch, eyes half-lidded, so still that Emily felt her own shoulders unclench. The fur there was warmer now, less icy against her fingertips. The little body didn't resist. For a heartbeat, a rare, quiet heartbeat, something familiar landed in the room. The sensation of a life being trusted to her care, undeserved and absolute. The raccoon finished the second sliver of chicken and sat back on her haunches in the basket, as if declaring intermission. Then, with theatrical slow motion, she hooked a paw over the lip of the basket and tugged a dish towel toward her chest until it flopped over her head like a veil. She froze, hidden, a lump with a tail. Sophie snorted. Emily bit down on a smile that spread anyway. "She's ridiculous," Sophie whispered. "She's buying time," Emily said. The wind moaned down the eaves, the rain softened. Across the room, Emily's tea had gone cold. The house felt smaller, somehow warmer. Every sound nested in the kitchen with them. The heater's low hum, the tick of the stove's cooling metal, Sophie's steady breath. It struck Emily that she could count the peaceful rooms in her life on one hand, and this was one of them. Here, damp towels and a laundry basket and a child whose laughter sounded like spring trying the door. A firm knock jolted them. Sophie startled upright. The raccoon's head popped out from under the towel, mask lifted, ears cocked. "Stay here," Emily said, and went to the front door. Mr. Harris stood on the porch, cap beaded with rain, jaw set in that retired cop line Sophie had nicknamed the Look. He'd introduced himself the second day they moved in, and had since supervised their recycling, with a diligence usually reserved for traffic stops. "Evening," he said, peering past her shoulder. "You got something rummaging in that garage. Saw tracks by my cans." "We found her," Emily said. "She's hurt." "Her," he repeated, as if gendering trouble were a first mistake. "You know, raccoons are a whole lot of headache. Animal control will tell you." "I called," Emily said. "They aren't coming. Not tonight." He looked at her a long second, rain tapping the brim of his cap. "They'll come faster if I call." "Please don't," Sophie said from behind Emily, voice small but steady. She held the bowl from the kitchen like an offering. "She just needs a little time." Mr. Harris shifted his weight, looked past Emily into the warm rectangle of their kitchen, to the basket on the floor, and the small, damp life hunched there in a towel. He cleared his throat, an old sound, and pulled his cap down another half-inch. "One night," he said, not quite gruff, not quite kind. "You keep her in, doors shut, and you call in the morning." "We will," Emily said. She meant it. He nodded once and stepped back into the rain. When he was gone, Sophie sagged with a relief that looked too big for her small frame. Emily closed the door and leaned her forehead against it for a second, the weight of all the decisions she hadn't made yet pressed down. Then Sophie's hand slipped into hers, warm, certain in a way that made Emily straighten. Back in the kitchen, the raccoon had climbed onto the rim of the basket again, this time balancing like an acrobat on a tightrope. She swayed, glanced at them with shameless interest, and toppled in a soft thud onto the towels, legs splayed, eyes blinking as if to say, "Did you see that?" Sophie laughed out loud, a bright ringing sound that ricocheted off the cabinets and settled right in Emily's ribs. They set up a small camp in the living room, the basket near the couch where Emily could keep watch. Sophie brought her sketchbook and, after getting permission from the raccoon with a cautious glance and a respectfully slow sit, began to draw. Line by careful line, the small masked face appeared on the page, then the slick curve of the tail, then the lifted paw with its polite bandage. The heater hummed. The rain finally thinned to a whisper on the roof. "Mom," Sophie said without looking up, "what if nobody ever comes for her?" "We came," Emily said. It surprised her to hear the words, to feel them fit. "We'll do right by her, and when it's time, we'll let the right people do the rest." Sophie nodded, the pencil pausing just long enough for the agreement to settle. The raccoon yawned, a small, toothy hinge, then tucked her nose under her bandaged paw and closed her eyes. Near midnight, Emily dozed with a blanket over her knees and woke to a gentle rustle. The raccoon had stood, tested her weight, and, with the shameless curiosity of a burglar in training, hooked a paw around the knit edge of Emily's slipper. She tugged once, triumphant, then sat back on her haunches, with the slipper pressed to her chest like a stolen treasure. Sophie clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a giggle. Emily shook her head and surrendered the slipper with a sigh that felt suspiciously like gratitude. Outside, the rain gave up. Inside, the house held the small sounds of sleep. Emily looked at the basket, at the square of moonlight on the floor, at her daughter bent over the sketchbook, eyes drooping. She felt the fragile balance of it all, the rules and the needs, the wild and the warm, and for the first time in a long while, didn't feel afraid of what morning would ask her to decide. "Just for tonight," she whispered, tucking a corner of the towel more snugly around the raccoon's shoulders. The creature didn't stir. Sophie's pencil slipped from her fingers and rolled under the couch with the softest clink. Emily picked up her cold tea, lifted it in a private toast to no one and everything, and took a sip that still tasted like comfort. Somewhere in the dark, a storm moved on. In their small room, a joke unspooled and then went quiet, waiting for its next cue. And Emily, nurse and mother and keeper of broken things, sat watch over a tiny bandit who had stolen a slipper, a towel, and, before she could stop it, the first piece of her heart. Morning crept into Asheville like it always did, pale and reluctant, the mountains still wearing a crown of fog. Emily hadn't slept much. She had drifted in and out on the couch, one ear tuned to the heater, the other to the faint rustle of the basket by the wall. Each time she opened her eyes, she found the raccoon exactly where she'd left her, sometimes curled in a ball under the towel, sometimes sprawled on her back as though the basket were a stage and she had rehearsed this pose all her life. Sophie came padding into the living room in her socks, hair a wild halo from sleep. She crouched beside the basket and whispered, "Morning, little lady." The raccoon stirred, blinked one bright eye, and tugged Sophie's pencil from the edge of her sketchbook. She rolled it across her chest like a magician palming a coin. Sophie laughed quietly, covering her mouth. Emily watched them, fighting the tug of a smile. She rubbed her temples. "She's not staying," she said, though her voice lacked the iron she'd meant to put in it. "Just until she's better," Sophie replied. She traced a line along the basket's rim with one finger, her eyes soft, already full of an affection that scared Emily more than the animal itself. Emily fetched coffee, strong and bitter, and tried the wildlife center again. She explained the swollen paw, the storm, her daughter's worry. The voice on the other end cut her short. "Ma'am, raccoons are not intake animals for us. Too aggressive, too high a risk for disease. Your best bet is animal control." She hung up with a sigh. They hadn't called back last night. They wouldn't rush today. And Sophie, overhearing every word, now had tears balanced on her lashes. That was the moment Mr. Harris chose to knock. Emily opened the front door to the sight of him standing rigid on her porch, cap squared, hands tucked in his jacket. He was the kind of man whose voice always carried an edge of authority, even retired. "Morning," he said. "You still got that raccoon?" Emily steadied her mug in her hand. "We kept her inside overnight. She's resting." "Resting?" His eyes narrowed. "They don't rest. They destroy. I had one tear apart my attic back in '09. Cost me $3,500 a year of peace. You're not thinking straight." "She's hurt," Emily said, keeping her tone level. "She's wild," Harris corrected. His gaze slid past her, toward the living room. "And wild doesn't belong in your basket or your kitchen. Call animal control, and I mean today, before she makes this whole street her playground." Sophie appeared at Emily's side, clutching her sketchbook like armor. "She's not dangerous," she said, voice trembling but clear. "She's just small. She just needs help." Harris's jaw tightened. "Young lady, you've never seen the damage they do. They'll bite when you least expect it. They'll spread things you don't want." Emily set her coffee down, aware of her pulse ticking faster. "Mr. Harris, I appreciate the concern. But until I get through to the right people, she stays warm and safe. That's all I can offer." His eyes held hers for a long beat, old battles written in every crease. Finally, he tugged his cap lower. "One night," he said again, like a rule carved into stone. "That's what you promised me yesterday. Don't stretch it." He turned on his heel and walked back down the steps, boots crunching on damp gravel. The silence he left behind was heavier than the rain. Sophie leaned into Emily, whispering fiercely, "He doesn't get it." Emily didn't answer. She closed the door, locked it, and returned to the living room. The raccoon was standing in the basket now, one paw still wrapped in gauze, balancing on her hind legs like a circus performer demanding applause. She swayed once, then tumbled backward into the towels with such exaggerated drama that Sophie giggled through her tears. "She's mocking him," Sophie said. Emily shook her head, but she couldn't stop the smile that broke across her tired face. By afternoon, the raccoon had revealed her true skill: improvisation. She dragged one of Emily's slippers into the basket like a stolen prize. She balanced Sophie's eraser on her nose for a fleeting second before letting it drop into her water bowl. She even managed to climb half the way out of the basket and hang there upside down until Sophie gasped and Emily scooped her back with a towel. But not all comedy was welcome. When Emily stepped out to bring in the mail, she returned to find the raccoon halfway up the curtains, claws hooked, eyes wide with mischief. Sophie was doubled over laughing. Emily rushed to lift her down, heart pounding, muttering, "You're going to bring the whole house down." The racket must have carried, because Harris reappeared on the sidewalk, arms crossed, gaze hard. Emily closed the blinds before he could knock again. Dinner was quiet, punctuated by small rustles from the basket. Sophie insisted on setting aside scraps of chicken. When Emily allowed her to drop them into the basket, the raccoon accepted each piece with a solemnity that looked almost staged, then promptly tried to juggle them, flipping one chunk into the air and catching it on the rebound. Sophie laughed so hard she snorted, and even Emily choked on her bite of toast. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table. The basket was quiet, the small masked face tucked beneath the towel. She opened her laptop, pulled up the hospital schedule, and stared at the empty boxes where shifts should have been. Life already felt balanced on a thread. The new town, the custody weekends, the stack of unpaid bills she never let Sophie see. Now, a raccoon that made her daughter laugh again. Yes, but also a raccoon that could upend what little order she had left. A thump interrupted her thoughts. Emily turned. The raccoon had managed to crawl out of the basket and was now perched on the back of the couch, tail flicking, eyes bright with mischief. She looked directly at Emily, then pounced onto the coffee table, landing with a flourish that sent Sophie's forgotten crayons scattering like confetti. The raccoon froze, chest puffed, as though waiting for applause. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a laugh she didn't want to admit. "You're trouble," she whispered. "Pure trouble." From upstairs came Sophie's sleepy voice. "What happened?" "Nothing, sweetheart," Emily called back. She bent to gather the crayons, and the raccoon snatched one right from under her hand and scurried back into the basket, triumphant. By the time Emily returned to the couch, she found herself chuckling softly in spite of everything. Trouble, yes, but also a spark in a house that had gone too long without one. That night, as the heater hummed and Sophie dreamed upstairs, Emily wrote in a spiral notebook she hadn't touched since nursing school. Just one line. Then she shut it quick, embarrassed even with no one to see. She makes us laugh." And when she glanced at the basket, she could have sworn the raccoon was smiling too, curled around that stolen crayon like it was the punchline to a joke only she understood. By the third morning, the rain had gone, but the air still smelled of wet wood and mud. Sunlight slipped between the blinds in skinny gold lines, brushing across the floorboards where Sophie sat cross-legged with her sketchbook. She'd already drawn half a dozen pictures of the little raccoon, each more detailed than the last. The masked face, the bandaged paw, the cocked head that always looked like a question. Emily leaned in the doorway with her coffee, still shaking off the weight of night shifts and unpaid bills. The raccoon had grown bolder, climbing out of the basket whenever she pleased. At that moment she was perched on the windowsill, staring out at the street like a queen surveying her tiny kingdom. Her tail twitched in slow rhythm. "She looks better," Sophie said softly, shading in the fur, almost like she knows this is her house now. "This isn't her house," Emily replied, though she didn't put much force behind it. She crossed the room and tapped the glass beside the raccoon. "You're just visiting, little lady." The raccoon blinked, then pressed her nose against the window, leaving a small, foggy circle, as if writing her name. It didn't take long for the chaos to start. While Emily loaded the dishwasher, Sophie set a small bowl of cereal on the table. The raccoon dropped down from the sill, waddled over with her awkward bandaged gait, and without hesitation, plunged a paw straight into the bowl. Milk sloshed across the table, Cheerios scattering to the floor like spilled coins. "Sophie!" Emily exclaimed, reaching for paper towels. But Sophie was doubled over, giggling so hard she couldn't breathe. She's eating like Uncle Greg at Thanksgiving." The raccoon ignored them both, licking each paw daintily between bites, then standing on her hind legs to swipe the dripping spoon. Milk ran down her chin. Sophie laughed so loud, Emily found herself biting back a smile. It became clear the raccoon had a gift for timing. When Emily's phone rang that afternoon, and she tried to sound professional, speaking to the hospital scheduler about next week's shifts, the raccoon clambered onto the coffee table and collapsed in an exaggerated heap, legs stiff, tongue hanging. Sophie burst out laughing, and Emily had to choke down her own laughter while assuring the scheduler she was absolutely available for Wednesday nights. That evening, after Sophie had gone upstairs to shower, Emily settled on the couch with a notebook. She hadn't written in months, not since the divorce, not since the move. The words had always come easy before, during nursing school or those rare, quiet weekends. Now they stuck. She wrote a single line. "Some things heal by accident, some by care," and stopped. A rustle drew her attention. The raccoon had crept onto the arm of the couch, balancing with surprising grace. She watched Emily's pen move across the page, then suddenly darted forward, snatched the pen, and scurried across the cushions. "Hey!" Emily lunged, laughing despite herself. The raccoon held the pen between her paws like a prize fighter holding a trophy, then dropped it with a flourish and flopped onto her back, paws in the air. "You're ridiculous," Emily whispered, retrieving the pen. The raccoon looked up at her upside down, eyes glinting. By the time Sophie came back downstairs, the raccoon had found a new target, the laundry basket. She tugged a sock free, then another, dragging them across the floor like trophies. Sophie shrieked with laughter, chasing her in circles around the room until both collapsed in a heap on the rug. Emily sighed, shaking her head, but she couldn't deny the light in Sophie's eyes. That light had been gone for months. The next day brought fresh antics. Emily left her slippers by the door. When she returned from checking the mail, one was gone. She found it under the kitchen table, the raccoon curled around it like a cat around a kitten. Later, she caught her on the counter, tugging a dish towel onto the floor, then proudly standing on it as if claiming new territory. "She thinks everything's hers," Emily muttered, scooping the raccoon back into her basket. She's just funny, Sophie insisted, sketching another quick picture. Like a clown. The climax came on the third evening. Emily had just set a pot of pasta on the stove when she heard Sophie squeal. She rushed into the living room to find the raccoon halfway up the curtains, clinging like a mountaineer, tail swishing. "Oh, no, you don't," Emily said, stepping forward. The raccoon looked down, blinked once, then launched herself off the fabric. She landed in the laundry basket with a soft thud, scattering towels, and rolled over with theatrical flair. Sophie screamed with laughter, rolling on the floor herself. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, half terrified, half amused. "You're going to kill me, you know that," she said to the raccoon, who yawned as if bored by her own performance. That night, Sophie asked if she could upload one of the videos she'd taken. Emily hesitated, worried about attention, about rules, about everything. But Sophie's eyes shone. "Please, Mom. Just to show Ellie and Marcus at school." Emily relented. Sophie posted a short clip titled "Raccoon Does Kitchen Comedy." It showed the raccoon tumbling off the counter, rolling onto her back, and swiping at the dish towel with exaggerated grunts. By morning, the video had 50,000 views. Emily nearly dropped her coffee when Sophie showed her. "People love her," Sophie cried. "Look at the comments. Funniest raccoon ever. Try not to laugh. I want 10 of these." Emily stared at the screen, a knot tightening in her chest. She looked at the raccoon, now curled innocently in the basket, one paw draped across her face as if embarrassed by the fame. "This is trouble," Emily whispered. But Sophie was radiant, laughter spilling out of her like light. For the first time in months, Emily thought maybe trouble wasn't the worst thing. The first warm Saturday of spring broke over Asheville with the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke still lingering in the air. Emily had hoped for a quiet morning, maybe coffee on the porch while Sophie sketched. But quiet was no longer part of their household vocabulary. The raccoon had other plans. It started with the garbage. Emily had rolled the cans to the curb the night before. When she stepped outside in her robe, she froze. The lid was off one can, and shredded paper towels, apple cores, and half a loaf of stale bread lay scattered across the driveway. Perched proudly on top of the heap was their little guest, tail swishing like a flag. She had both paws buried in a cereal box and looked up at Emily with all the innocence of a child caught red-handed. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Emily groaned. The raccoon squeaked, a sound suspiciously close to a laugh, and dragged the box toward the bushes. Sophie appeared in the doorway with her phone already recording, whisper shouting, "She's stealing breakfast." Emily tried to shoo the raccoon back inside, but their neighbor across the street had already noticed. Mrs. Calhoun, a retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, stood on her porch, shaking her head. "You better keep that creature contained, Emily. They'll tear up the whole block." Emily felt her cheeks burn. Before she could answer, the raccoon bolted down the sidewalk, the cereal box flopping against her chest like a prize purse. Sophie chased after her, giggling uncontrollably. By noon, the little bandit had turned the neighborhood into a stage. She climbed onto the mailman's cart, tugging at envelopes until one fluttered free. She dragged a baguette from the corner bakery's display basket before Emily could apologize to the horrified clerk. She even tried to pry open the latch of Mr. Harris's tool shed, her tiny fingers nimble as a lockpick. Harris stormed outside, face red. "I warned you, Carter," he barked. "This is what happens when you harbor wild animals. I'm calling animal control right now." Sophie threw her arms around the raccoon protectively, tears springing to her eyes. "Don't let them take her, Mom. Please. She doesn't mean any harm." Emily's heart twisted. The raccoon squirmed free and darted under the porch, popping her head out with a triumphant squeak, as though mocking Harris's authority. That might have been the end of it, if not for Linda. 17 years old, quick with a grin, Linda lived 2 houses down. She had been watching the spectacle from her front yard, phone in hand. Instead of scolding, she laughed. "She's hilarious. I got the whole thing on video," Emily groaned. "Please don't post that." But by evening, Linda had already uploaded a clip to her TikTok. The raccoon stealing the baguette, Sophie chasing her, Emily apologizing in the background, and Harris shaking his fist. The caption read, "Neighborhood drama, raccoon versus retired cop." Within hours, it had racked up thousands of likes. By dinner time, Emily's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. Friends from the hospital texted, "Is this your raccoon?" Even her sister called, laughing so hard she could barely get the words out. Emily buried her face in her hands. "This is out of control." Sophie only smiled, feeding the raccoon a grape from her plate. "She's famous, Mom. People love her." The raccoon, as if to prove the point, stood on her hind legs and bowed, then toppled over into Sophie's lap with a squeal that sounded like applause. That night, Emily sat at the kitchen table with Mr. Harris's threat echoing in her head. Animal control could show up any day. She imagined uniforms, nets, and a frightened creature dragged away. She looked at Sophie, who was curled on the couch with the raccoon tucked under her arm, sketchbook balanced on her knees. The child who had once sat in silence now laughed, chattered, and drew every whisker with care. Emily rubbed her temples. Trouble, yes, but trouble that brought joy, laughter, and, whether she wanted to admit it or not, hope. Still, as the raccoon tugged another sock from the laundry basket and scampered across the floor, Emily knew the balance was fragile. One more outburst, one more call from a neighbor, and the comedy could end in heartbreak. The raccoon rolled onto her back, paws in the air, clutching the sock like a trophy. Sophie squealed with delight. Emily exhaled slowly, whispering to herself, "We're not going to survive this." But the truth was plain in her heart. She didn't want to imagine surviving without it, either. It was still dark when Emily woke to the sound of silence. The house had grown used to a nightly rhythm, rustles in the laundry basket, the soft scrape of claws on the floor, Sophie's muffled laughter drifting down the hallway. But this morning, there was nothing. The silence was so complete it felt wrong, like a joke with the punchline missing. She slipped from bed and padded into the living room. The basket sat empty, the towel half pulled to the floor. No masked face peeking out, no gleaming eyes waiting for dawn. Emily's stomach tightened. She searched under the couch, behind the curtains, even in the laundry hamper. But the raccoon was nowhere. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair tangled from sleep. "Where is she?" Her voice was small, panicked. Emily swallowed. Maybe she found a way out. The look on Sophie's face broke her heart. The child clutched her sketchbook like a life preserver. She wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't. They tore through the house, basement, attic, closets, even the garage where it had all begun. The raccoon had vanished. By sunrise, Sophie was outside in her rain boots, calling softly into the hedges. "Come back, little lady. Please come back." Her voice cracked on the last word. Emily followed the trail of tiny prints through the damp soil around the garden and toward the fence. The paw marks stopped at a gap under the boards, the kind small animals had used for decades. Beyond lay the woods, dark, tangled, and endless. Sophie dropped to her knees in the mud, tears streaking her face. "She's gone, Mom. She left me." Emily crouched beside her, brushing wet hair from her daughter's cheek. "We don't know that. Maybe she's close. Maybe she'll come back." But Sophie shook her head fiercely. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Later that morning, Mr. Harris spotted them in the yard. He leaned on the fence, expression unreadable. "She finally went back where she belongs," he said. Sophie's eyes flared. "She belongs with us." Harris started to reply, but stopped when he saw her tears. His tone softened. "Kid, raccoons don't think like we do. Sometimes they just disappear. It's in their blood." Emily expected Sophie to argue, but instead she buried her face against her sketchbook, silent. Harris shifted uncomfortably, then cleared his throat. "I'll help you look, just in case." The three of them spent hours searching the neighborhood. They peered under porches, checked garages, asked neighbors. Mrs. Calhoun reported seeing a blur of gray fur near her garden the night before. The mailman swore something rustled in his cart at dawn, but no one could say for certain. By late afternoon, Sophie was exhausted. She trudged beside Emily, boots caked in mud, clutching her drawings of the raccoon. "What if she's hurt?" she whispered. "We'll keep looking," Emily promised, though doubt gnawed at her. They found her just before dusk. Sophie had wandered toward the old Miller house, long abandoned, its porch sagging under years of neglect. From beneath the steps came a faint, pitiful whimper. Emily dropped to her knees, heart racing. There, wedged between a beam and a rusted pipe, lay the raccoon. Her fur was matted with dirt, eyes half closed. She tried to move but whimpered again. Her bandaged paw twisted awkwardly. "Oh, sweetheart," Emily breathed. She reached in gently, sliding her hands under the small body. The raccoon was trembling, but didn't resist. She lay limp in Emily's arms, heavy with exhaustion. Sophie let out a sob of relief. "I thought we lost her forever." Even Harris, standing a few steps back, let out a long breath. "Lucky you found her," he muttered. Back home, Emily cleaned the wound carefully, rewrapping the bandage with steady hands. The raccoon gazed up at her with weary eyes, but made no protest. Sophie sat beside her, stroking the damp fur, whispering, "Don't scare me like that again." That night, the house felt smaller, quieter, as though everyone was holding their breath. Sophie refused to sleep in her own bed, curling up on the couch next to the basket. The raccoon slept too, chest rising and falling steadily, one paw resting against Sophie's arm. Emily sat nearby, notebook open, but she didn't write. She simply watched. The child who had thought she'd been abandoned. The creature who had risked the woods only to return broken. And the fragile thread binding them all. Harris stopped by once more before turning in. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, voice rough. "Guess I was wrong about her." Emily met his eyes. She chose to come back. He nodded once, then left without another word. The next morning, Sophie woke with the raccoon nestled against her chest. She smiled through sleepy eyes, whispering, "See, Mom, she belongs here." Emily didn't answer right away. She looked at the basket, at her daughter's face, at the tiny life that had somehow filled the empty corners of their home. For the first time, she wondered if Sophie might be right. The days after the raccoon's disappearance seemed to stretch longer than they should. Sophie clung to her furry friend every waking moment, following her around the house like a shadow. The child's laughter had returned, but it was tinged with something new: fear. Fear that if she blinked, the raccoon might vanish again into the woods, this time for good. Emily noticed it too. She found Sophie sleeping on the living room floor with her hand resting against the basket, or sketching for hours with the raccoon curled at her feet. Even Mr. Harris, who stopped by with an awkward knock, seemed reluctant to voice any more warnings. He simply muttered, "Keep an eye on her," and went on his way. For a short while, the household found a new rhythm. The raccoon's paw healed enough for her to climb onto chairs and counters, though Emily scolded her each time. She stole socks, knocked pencils to the floor, and even dragged Sophie's hairbrush into the basket like a crown jewel. Chaos, yes, but familiar chaos, comforting in its absurdity. And then, one morning, she was gone again. Emily woke to an open back door. She swore she had locked it, but the latch was flimsy, and the raccoon's clever paws had worked it free. Sophie's wail of despair filled the house when she realized. "She promised me she'd stay," the girl sobbed, though Emily knew no such promise had ever been spoken. This time, there were no prints in the mud, no whimper from beneath the porch. Just silence. The woods loomed at the edge of the yard, whispering with secrets. Sophie refused to eat. She carried her sketchbook everywhere, drawing raccoons on every page as though capturing her friend in graphite could keep her close. Emily tried to soothe her, but her own heart ached too. The house was emptier, laughter gone, and even the nights felt colder. 3 days passed. Each night Sophie stood at the back door, whispering into the dark, "Come back. Please come back." On the 4th night, a storm rolled through. Rain lashed against the windows, wind rattled the shutters. Emily tucked Sophie into bed, though the girl fought sleep with every blink. Emily herself sat awake, staring at the back door as lightning flashed across the yard. Then she heard it, scratching, faint at first, then urgent. Emily shot to her feet, heart pounding. She yanked open the door and froze. There she was, the raccoon, soaked to the bone, fur plastered against her body. Her eyes glimmered in the porch light, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, huddled close, was a smaller figure. A raccoon cub, barely 8 weeks old, shivering from the cold. "Mom!" Sophie cried, racing down the stairs. Her gasp echoed Emily's shock. "She's a mom!" The larger raccoon stepped inside without hesitation, shaking water from her fur. The cub followed timidly, wide-eyed and uncertain. Sophie dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms gently around the raccoon's neck. "You came back," she whispered. "You came back, and you brought family." Emily knelt beside them, stunned. She had never considered this possibility, that the raccoon's disappearances were not abandonment, but responsibility. She had been out there surviving, protecting, and now she had chosen to bring her child into their home. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving sunlight streaming through the windows. Emily called Dr. Louise, an elderly veterinarian who had once worked at a wildlife preserve. Within the hour, Louise sat cross-legged on the living room floor, letting the raccoon approach her on her own terms. "She's healthy," Louise said, stroking her chin thoughtfully. She turned to the smaller cub, who peeked out from behind his mother's tail. "And that little one can't be more than 2 months old. You're very lucky." "Lucky?" Emily asked. Louise smiled. "She trusts you enough to bring her baby here. That's not instinct. That's a choice." The words sank deep into Emily's chest. She looked at Sophie, who was already sketching the new arrival, pencil flying across the page, as though she'd been waiting her whole life for this. Sophie named the cub Pebble. "Because he's small but strong," she explained. like the little stones you keep in your pocket. From then on, the house echoed with twice the noise, twice the mischief. Pebble learned quickly, following his mother's lead, stealing socks, tipping over water bowls, even hiding in Emily's laundry basket. Sophie laughed until her sides hurt, chasing both raccoons through the hall. But at night, when the house grew quiet, Emily lay awake with questions pressing on her mind. How long could this last? How long before the wild called them back? One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Emily stood at the edge of the yard. The raccoon sat beside her, Pebble tumbling clumsily through the grass. For a long moment, Emily felt the weight of the woods pressing against them, a reminder that some bonds were temporary no matter how fierce. Still, when the raccoon brushed against her leg before leading Pebble inside, Emily whispered, "Thank you for choosing us." In her heart, she knew this chapter of chaos and laughter was a gift, one she would hold as long as it lasted. By the time April rolled around, Asheville's mornings carried the soft warmth of spring, and the Carter household carried the constant noise of two raccoons. Pebble, the younger cub, had grown bold, tumbling through hallways and hiding under beds. His mother still stole socks and acted as though the kitchen belonged to her, but now she had an accomplice. What had once been a fragile secret had become a circus. Emily tried to hold the line. She laid down rules: no climbing curtains, no raiding the pantry, no sneaking into the laundry room. But rules meant little to a pair of raccoons who lived for mischief. One afternoon, Emily returned from the grocery store to find Pebble perched on top of the refrigerator, his mother standing below like a cheerleader. Sophie laughed so hard she fell to the floor, clutching her stomach. "They're unstoppable," she gasped between giggles. Unstoppable, yes, but beloved too. The neighborhood had shifted. Where once Mrs. Calhoun scowled from her porch, now she lingered at the fence, watching with reluctant amusement. Even Harris, still pretending to be the skeptic, couldn't hide the way his lips twitched when Pebble toppled over chasing his own tail. The videos made the rounds online. Linda, the teenager with her phone always ready, captured clip after clip, Pebble stealing a sandwich, the mother raccoon tugging on a rug until Sophie tripped, both of them climbing into an open dresser drawer. "Raccoon Reality Show," Linda titled one video. Within hours it had thousands of views. Emily worried about the attention, but Sophie's joy was undeniable. The girl who had once been so quiet at school now carried confidence like a lantern, which is why, when Sophie came home with a flyer for the annual Show Tell Day, she looked at her mother with pleading eyes. "I want to tell their story," Sophie said. "Not just the funny parts, the whole thing." Emily hesitated. "You mean the raccoons?" "Yes, they're my friends. Everyone should know." Harris overheard from the porch that evening. He was leaning on the fence, watching Pebble try to squeeze into a flower pot. "She should do it," he said gruffly. "Might be the only school report kids actually listen to." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering to chaperone two raccoons at a grade school?" Harris didn't answer, but a week later, on the morning of the event, he showed up at their door with a pet carrier and a resigned expression. "One time," he said, "don't make me regret it." At the school auditorium, Sophie stood at the front of her class, clutching her drawings. She had sketched every moment: the first night in the basket, the sock thefts, the rainstorm when they returned with Pebble. Her voice was steady, clear, in a way Emily had rarely heard before. "I never gave her a name," Sophie said, "because I think she didn't ask for one. She isn't a pet, she's my friend. And she taught me that not everything wild has to be tamed." The room was silent. Even the fidgety boys in the back leaned forward. For a moment, Sophie thought she was done. And then, the carrier rattled. The mother raccoon had forced the latch. With one practiced shove, she slipped free, Pebble right behind her. Gasps echoed through the room as both raccoons bounded across the stage. Sophie froze. Emily half rose from her chair. And then the show began. The mother raccoon snatched the teacher's handkerchief from the desk, flicking it like a magician's cape. Pebble rolled across the floor, paws tangled in notebook paper. Together they scampered in circles, tails high, pausing only to leap onto the podium and knock Sophie's pencil case to the ground. The children erupted in laughter. Even the teacher, a stern woman who rarely smiled, covered her mouth to hide a chuckle. "Well," she murmured, "that's certainly memorable." Sophie didn't panic. She laughed, louder than anyone, her eyes bright. She knelt and clapped her hands. "Show's over, comedians." To everyone's surprise, both raccoons scampered back to her side as if bowing for applause. The auditorium burst into cheers. Phones were out, recording every second. By the end of the day, Raccoon Steals the Show was already trending in town, Linda's video hitting tens of thousands of views before dinner. Back home that evening, Sophie sat on the porch steps with both raccoons curled beside her. She leaned against Emily and whispered, "I wasn't scared, Mom. I felt like they were on my side." Emily wrapped an arm around her daughter, gazing at the twilight settling over the hills. "They were," she said softly. "And so was I." Harris, sitting a few steps away with his arms crossed, snorted. "Steals the show, huh? You better start charging admission." Pebble answered with a squeak and promptly tugged Harris's shoelace loose. For once, the old man laughed out loud. And in that laughter, child, mother, neighbor, and raccoon alike. Emily realized something. They were no longer a family of two. They were something stranger, louder, more complicated, and perhaps more complete. Summer settled into Asheville with the heavy scent of honeysuckle and the buzz of cicadas that filled the air at dusk. By then, the Carter's house had stopped feeling like a quiet refuge and started feeling like the backdrop to a comedy show that ran day and night. Socks went missing, shoes turned up on the porch roof, and not a single roll of paper towels survived longer than a week. What had once been chaos now felt like a rhythm all its own, as though the house itself had agreed to join the performance. The raccoon mother claimed the living room rug as her stage, sprawling on her back whenever visitors arrived. Pebble followed her lead, tumbling across the floor as if rehearsing a slapstick routine. Sophie adored them both, sketching furiously to capture each pose. Her notebooks filled with drawings, each line more confident, each page a memory she refused to let fade. Emily still worried, of course. She worried about the neighbors, though their complaints had turned to curiosity. She worried about rules and authorities, though no one had come knocking. Most of all, she worried about the wild, the quiet tug of the woods that could call her unexpected guests away at any moment. Yet every evening, when Sophie's laughter rang through the house, and even Mr. Harris chuckled from his chair on the porch, Emily let herself believe they had been chosen, at least for now. It was Harris, of all people, who changed the way the neighborhood saw them. He'd once been their fiercest critic, but one evening, as Pebble wrestled with his shoelaces for the third time that week, he leaned back and laughed so loud it startled the streetlights into flickering. "Guess she's family now," he said, scratching the cub gently between the ears. "Whether we like it or not." Word spread quickly. Neighbors stopped by not to complain, but to catch a glimpse of the little performers. Linda set up her phone on the curb and streamed what she called the Sock Heist Chronicles. Children brought old toys to leave on the porch, delighted to see them dragged away like treasures. Even Mrs. Calhoun, who had once scolded Emily for harboring wild animals, arrived with a plate of cookies and a stiff smile. "For the girl," she said. But when the raccoon mother nosed her hand politely, Mrs. Calhoun's eyes softened. Inside the house, Emily began to see changes she hadn't expected. Sophie spoke up more at school, her teachers calling to say she had blossomed, her voice steady when she presented her drawings. At home, she hummed while she worked, laughter bubbling easily. Emily herself found something loosening in her chest, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight since the divorce. The laughter, the ridiculousness, the quiet moments of care. All of it was stitching them back together. One evening in late July, the sun slid low and painted the yard in amber light. Emily set out lemonade on the porch, and Harris pulled up a chair, muttering about free entertainment. Sophie sat cross-legged on the steps, Pebble curled in her lap, the mother raccoon stretched beside her. Linda hovered with her phone, grinning. Then Pebble struck. With the speed of a thief in training, he snatched Harris's sandwich right from the plate. He darted across the porch, the bread dangling from his mouth like a trophy. Harris jumped up, swearing softly before breaking into laughter. "You little bandit, that was my dinner." The porch erupted with laughter. Sophie's high and ringing, Linda's breathless, Emily's warm and full, Harris's gruff and honest. Even Mrs. Calhoun, passing by with her evening paper, smiled despite herself. For a moment, Emily stepped back and watched it all. A porch full of people, a child glowing with joy, a neighbor who had found his laugh again, a community bound together by two mischievous raccoons, a broken family pieced together not by blood or vows but by laughter, chaos and choice. She felt Sophie lean against her side, whispering, "She was never just a pet, was she?" Emily shook her head, smiling through the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart. She was our comedian, our friend." As twilight deepened, the raccoon mother climbed onto the porch railing. She looked out toward the woods, tail flicking, eyes catching the last of the light. For a breath, Emily feared she would leap down and vanish again. But then she turned back, dropped neatly onto the porch, and settled herself at Sophie's feet with Pebble tucked close. And just like that, Emily understood. The wild would always be out there, waiting. But for now, for tonight, they had chosen this porch, this family, this strange and joyful little corner of the world. In the distance, the cicadas hummed. On the porch, laughter lingered like music, and in the heart of a once quiet house, a raccoon who stole socks and sandwiches had stolen something far greater, a place in their lives, and the reminder that not everything wild needs taming. Some things just need a family willing to laugh along. If this mischievous raccoon brought a smile to your face, let us know with a quick comment below. Just drop a 0 if you laughed or a 1 if you think the world needs more stories like this. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next heartwarming tale waiting just around the corner.